Hi, my name's David. I run a small live streaming company based in the UK called Devonia Media. We do a range of different sorts of live streaming on the sort of small to medium scale. So, for example, we might do corporate events, seminars, we might do the odd wedding, the odd funeral. The kit we use, we demand that it's fairly flexible because we use it in a lot of different ways. We don't just replicate the same setup day to day. So, for example, we might take a room, we'll fill it with maybe 5 or 6 different cameras, we'll feed them all back into a vision mixer like the Blackmagic device you see over my shoulder here, and we put out what I'd like to say myself are fairly good looking, beautiful live streams. In order to do that, the sort of kit we use might include things like the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema 4K camera you're looking at me through now. You'll be aware that obviously isn't a PTZ camera, so we had to come up with a way of making it one. So I built a little interface for my ATEM that interfaces it with a Ronin. So you pop the Ronin on a tripod, you pop the camera on the Ronin, you have a little interface that goes between it all, and it allows me to use the ATEM's PTZ controls to control the Ronin. Well, that's great. That makes for a very versatile, efficient setup. I've got a high quality cinema camera on top of a fairly flexible gimbal. But I've got to power the Ronin, I've got to power the camera, I've got to get a signal back from the camera, I've got to get a signal out to the Ronin. It's not a nice, easy to deploy thing. So for a long time, I've been looking at PTZ cameras as an option. Now, if you have a look at the PTZ market, you'll realise that PTZ cameras, in my eyes, are surprisingly expensive. For example, Canon CR-N300, which is their sort of base model, is about £2,700 for the camera. For the controller, the IP100 to control it, you look about another £2,000. So quite easily, as soon as you've got 3 cameras and a controller, you can very easily knock at the door of about £10,000. Now, you might think, well, £2,700 isn't much for a camera. It's not if you're doing big corporate live streams all day, every day, but that's not the sort of area of the market we're in. It also strikes me that if Blackmagic could sell me a cinema camera, which is capable of 4K with a decent quality lens for about £2,000, and I can go out and buy a Ronin, which is a bunch of motors and some very clever electronics for a few £100s. I never really understood why a lower quality sensor with lower quality glass in front of it would cost so much money. So one day, up on my inbox screen popped an email from a supplier saying, oh, we're selling Marshall PTZ cameras, and the price caught my eye. The price for the basic model camera was about £960, and the controller on top of that was about £1,000. I thought, well, it starts to become a little bit more economically viable. So I went online, had a look for some sample footage, and I couldn't find any. So I emailed Marshall in the US, and they said, we don't have any sample footage. So they put me in touch with their UK rep, and I said, send me one, send me a controller, and I'll get you some sample footage, which is exactly what we're doing today. Just to be clear, Marshall haven't paid me to do this. They've lent me this kit for 10 days or so. I said I would give an honest review. The only caveat I sort of let them have is I said, if it's absolutely rubbish, then I'll just send it straight back to you. Well, the good news is it's not absolutely rubbish, so this is why we're doing the review. I'm going to show you around some of the sample footage a bit later on, but first of all, I'm going to just give you an idea of the equipment that you get for a £960 PTZ camera and a £1,000 PTZ controller. So we'll have a quick look at the camera first. Obviously not much to see on a PTZ camera, but I've just turned it round so you can just about see the back there. As well as a power input and RS-232 input, it's also got SDI output. There's another model that gives you USB output as an alternative and HDMI. I went for the SDI one to review. Note obviously that it can take power over Ethernet as an alternative to the power cable, which actually I find really useful. The controller can as well, so I've just got a single PoE hub here that's providing power for both of them, and obviously if I had more cameras it would just be a case of running SDI and Ethernet to them, which is great. There's a bit more to talk about when it comes to the controller. Controller just incidentally comes with a number of little breakout boxes. For example, you've got this little box that gives you the option to plug in RS-422, RS-232 cameras, and it also provides, as far as I know, I haven't tested it, but it provides PoE power to the controller and the camera through the power supply it comes with. We just have a quick look at the back here. We've got RS-232 and 422 ports, and we've also got a LAN PoE port. We've got a port here that allows you to use breakout cables. We've got a power switch as well, which some people particularly like having. We've got also just a very well-made controller. It's a metal chassis. It feels really solid. Having used some of the much more expensive Canon controllers, I was quite impressed with the build quality of this. It seems like something that should hopefully last a few years. The buttons are all nicely backlit, so you can see what you're doing if you're working in a dark environment. The joystick has a sort of good positive feel to it. It is proportional. If I just show you the speeds you get, this is all at max speed. This is our pan speed. It doesn't vary as you zoom in and out, so it doesn't give you that sort of varied pan control, but it is proportional. As I say, we can move it slowly and we can move it more quickly. That's the tilt speed. Obviously I can't show you the zoom speed because you can't see a picture from it at the moment, but you'll see that when you see the sample footage. Now, one of the things I like is I've got dedicated controls for a lot of the things I need. So for example, if I want to adjust the pan and tilt speed, I've got a knob here that just adjusts the pan and tilt speed, and I've got another one that adjusts the zoom speed with a little display there to show me what I'm getting. This knob also controls the menu system, so if I go into one of the menus, let's just go up into the setup menu, default password there, I can use this knob to scroll. I can then use the other knob to change different settings, but we'll come out of that menu just for now. When I plugged in the camera initially, all I had to do was give it an IP address on the same subnet as the controller, and after a couple of minutes the controller was able to see it very quickly. I've got buttons here that allow me to search for controllers using different protocols, find out what I've got on my network and then add them if I want to. I've got buttons here that allow me to assign custom features. So for example, at the moment F3 is assigned to turn the camera off, which I will do. So if I hit F3, probably wouldn't want to do that in a live streaming environment, but if I hit F3 there, it's turned the camera off, the camera's gone to sleep, and I can awaken it as well. And I just want to show you something when the camera does awake, which is quite nice. There we go, turn the camera on and it has shown me its IP address on the output, which I just find really useful. If you're trying to work out why your camera's not working, you're trying to find its IP address, all you have to do is turn it on and its output will show you that. Just go back to the controller here, got dedicated knobs here for things like white balance, focus, so I could turn off autofocus, and then I've got a manual focus button. I can change exposure through a variety of different modes as well, can adjust my black level, iris priority, shutter priority. I've got manual iris gain, manual shutter gain, and of course auto exposure. I think having these knobs dedicated to these functions is, to my mind, better than the approach that some manufacturers take, where they give you hundreds of different knobs, hundreds of different ways to assign different functions to different knobs. I'd rather just have a knob that says by it what it does, and then there's no ambiguity and no chance to mess it up in the middle of a live show. Now, if I adjust the camera, one of the things I can do, of course, with the controller is save and restore presets. So position the camera where I want it to point. Go to our little control panel here, our keypad here, and I can store a preset. Just press a number and hit preset, hold that a second, it'll save the preset. It shows me what it's doing in the little display here. If I then want to steer the camera elsewhere and I want to restore that preset, all I do is preset call and it'll restore that preset. Couple of things to note here. One is it doesn't store the focus function and the white balance function, the exposure function within that preset. So these won't override what I'm doing over here, which actually I think is a better way to work than have those encoded within these presets. Another thing to notice is we don't have any way of storing a track. So for example, with some more advanced controllers, I can steer the camera around manually and I can save that as a track that I can then recall. To be honest, I've never had much luck with that. I've never found I can steer the camera accurately enough using the joystick for that to be useful, so it's not something that I would miss, but if it is something that's important to you, be aware that this controller can't do it. One last really useful thing is this menu button. If you press it, the on-screen menu pops up on the camera, and you can then use the pan tilt control to scroll through the menus, access different settings. That's great because that means you don't have to have the camera connected to a laptop in order to change all the settings. It's time to have a look at some sample footage from this little Marshall camera. To give it a workout, I took it up to my village hall where they were right in the middle of the dress rehearsal for the annual village panto. The reason I wanted to do this is because I thought if the camera can cope with the sort of lighting you're going to get where you're using stage lighting, rapidly changing, very high contrast areas, then it could probably cope with anything. Now, of course, you can adjust the gain, the aperture and the shutter speed separately on this camera. You don't have ND filters, of course, built in, so you can't start dropping in ND filters. But with any PTZ camera, you've always got that difficulty of, because you're not able to easily monitor what the shutter, aperture and gain are doing, because usually all you have is a clean feed unless you go into the menu settings. Of course, that makes it quite difficult to use, say, 180-degree shutter speed whilst controlling your aperture and your gain if you can't monitor what the aperture and the gain are doing. So I made a slightly controversial decision to set the camera to its full automatic settings. As a bit of a contrast, I also took my Blackmagic Pocket Cinema 4K with me, and I also set that to auto exposure. I didn't even know it had an auto exposure mode before I tried it, but it does, and I thought it would be interesting to see how the two different cameras compared. One thing you'll have noticed is, of course, the dynamic range of the Marshall camera can't match that of the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera. Not surprisingly, given it's a cinema camera, it's considerably more expensive. But I think the dynamic range does sort of, it's favourable compared to what I thought it might be at this sort of price point. I don't think you're going to win any awards for dynamic range, but nonetheless, it's not a complete disaster. The camera's automatic exposure mode does tend, in my opinion, to overexpose with this sort of subject matter. So if you look at the skin tones, a lot of cases the skin tones are somewhat overexposed. Now, there is an option to turn on a backlight auto exposure mode, which then, depending on whether it's turned on or off, it raises or lowers the automatic exposure, and fiddling around with this did sort of help. Apart from that, you do then start to need to go into the manual exposure settings and start to expose manually, which is not what I wanted to do with this particular test, simply because in a real live streaming situation, most of the time you don't have time to start messing around with manual exposure when you're in the middle of a live event. I also wanted to see how well the camera would cope with pan, tilt and zoom in vision. So can you make a smooth movement with this camera whilst you're in vision, as opposed to using it for a series of predefined shots and moving between shots out of vision? Well, the answer is I think you can actually with this setup. Now, I'm pretty crap at doing this at the best of times, to be honest. I think with a bit more practice and a bit more skill, it would be possible to get nice, smooth in-vision moves with this camera. That doesn't apply to other more expensive PTZ cameras I've tried in the past. One thing I did notice is when zooming, you are potentially going to get some focus hunting going on, so it might be better in that situation to just drop into manual focus and then come back into autofocus once you're happy that it isn't going to start hunting around. A quick note on sensitivity. A couple of times during the testing I had the Blackmagic camera cranked up right to ISO 4000, which is kind of above where you'd ideally be shooting, and the Marshall under those lighting conditions did cope pretty well. There is some grain pretty clearly visible in darker areas of the footage, but overall I felt it coped fairly well with low light conditions. I also wanted to compare this camera to probably one of its nearest competitors, which is the Canon CR-N300, which, to be fair, is over 2.5 times the price. But if you were in the market for one of these cameras, that's something you might consider. First of all, we'll just have a look at the footage from the Marshall. Sorry about the unexciting subject matter. As the Marshall zooms in, you can sort of see it does hunt a little bit around the focus point. If we now compare that with the Canon, one of the things I noticed, which I don't know will be obvious on the YouTube video, but the Canon, to my mind, is substantially noisier in this lighting than the Marshall is. Obviously, one thing that Canon can do is zoom in an awful lot further. If anything, though, I did find that the pan and tilt motion was very slightly jerkier with the Canon than it was with the Marshall. Unfortunately, after I filmed this footage, I realised that the Canon was set to 720, unlike the Marshall, which was set to 1080p. Whereas with the Marshall, it's relatively easy to change this using the controller with the menu settings. With the Canon, I couldn't work out how to do it without a laptop, so unfortunately, I left it in 720. While I was at my friend's Silverstream TV, I was past another camera as well, which is a PTZ optics camera, a slightly older one. Just to give you an idea, this is a sort of footage you would get out of that older PTZ camera. I wasn't able to pan, tilt and zoom on it, unfortunately, because I couldn't get it to speak to the controller. And just looking at skin tones, if you look at the Canon footage of my cheerful face here, you'll see that the skin tones are, to my mind, a little bit flat. If we now have a look at the Marshall camera, unfortunately the auto white balance has slightly let itself down here. It has sort of rendered my face as slightly purple. I don't think my face is really purple. I think manually tuning the white balance would have solved a lot of problems here. So having had a few days to play with this little camera, I thought I'd share some pros and cons. Cons first, it's not a 4K camera. At this price point you wouldn't really expect it. A lot of people of course think they need 4K, but realistically for most live streaming cases you don't really need 4K. This will do up to 1080p 60, which is absolutely fine. It's not NDI compatible. Again, at this sort of price point you wouldn't expect it. I don't have an NDI workflow, so it doesn't bother me. What's far more important to me is SDI out, which of course this camera does have, which is great. I was pretty impressed with the low light performance in particular. I'm comparing it certainly to the Canon cameras. It actually stacked up pretty well. I'm quite happy with that. A lot of us, of course, in this area of the market are working in situations where we can't necessarily control the lighting. We don't have a full lighting rig to make everything look beautiful. We might be working in a dim and murky church or something like that. So good light performance is probably more valuable certainly than some of the other features. I'd say the automatic exposure, white balance and focus is sort of adequate rather than class leading. Again, that's kind of what you would expect at this sort of price point. I certainly wasn't disappointed in it. If you want autofocus that's going to be able to cope with a wider range of situations, then you're going to need to spend at least 2.5, if not sort of 5 times as much. I'm not going to give any conclusions to say yes, buy this or don't buy it. I think the test footage is something that will help you make up your own mind. One thing I just will add to wrap up is I had a couple of questions for Marshall during the course of reviewing this camera. Well, obviously I'm reviewing it, so you would expect them to be helpful, but I have found that Marshall have been really responsive. I've got very, very quick answers to them from the States if I needed to, and I think that kind of bodes well for a smaller manufacturer that people aren't necessarily as familiar with. Having a really responsive support department is something I would personally regard as a definite pro. Having said that was the last thing, it isn't. Just want to go back to the point I made a lot earlier about the build quality of this little controller. For the money, I wasn't expecting it to be as well built as it is. It's a really nicely built and nicely engineered unit, and certainly it is substantially better, I would say, than considerably more expensive units I've used from other manufacturers in the past. So thanks again for Marshall for the loan of the equipment, and if you've got any questions, pop them in the comments.